Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Power at Work blogcast. I'm Seth Harris, a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change. We've got just a terrific roundtable discussion on today's blogcast. Four outstanding labor reporters who bring different perspectives to the coverage of labor issues who are with us on this blogcast. We recorded this at the end of last week, but fortunately nothing really radical happened in between, so everything they said is still relevant. We have Matthew Cunningham-Cook, who's a researcher and writer with The Lever. We have Alexandra Martinez, who's a senior news producer at the Prism. We have Tim Noah, who's currently a Washington-based writer at The New Republic. I met him when he was the labor editor at Politico. And last but certainly not least, we have Noam Scheiber, who's a Chicago-based reporter for the New York Times, covering workers, labor, the labor movement more generally, sometimes covers some government stuff. He actually found a way to write an article that combined two of the hottest topics of the day, artificial intelligence and succession, in one story. So it's a terrific discussion. Some of it is about sort of the craft of reporting and how you decide what you're going to cover given the huge number of really important labor stories that are around nowadays. But also we talked about the issues themselves and their assessment of what are the big issues right now that are affecting workers and the labor movement and worker power. So it's a great discussion that's coming up in just a minute. Before we do that, there's a story I want to talk with you about. It's gotten some press coverage. It's certainly gotten a lot of local press coverage in the Cornell Daily Sun and the Ithaca Voice and the Ithaca Journal. A little bit of national coverage. I saw a Bloomberg story on this. It's about Cornell University and Starbucks. And it's a story I've been watching through my Twitter feed. Some of the folks on the Cornell campus have been tweeting about it. And I want to give a little bit of background because I have a very long-standing relationship with Cornell University. My oldest son graduated from there. I taught there. I am an alum of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. So I have a really long history and a lot of, it's really my alma mater. It's the soul of my heart. And I have a very close connection to it. I learned a tremendous amount there, not just from the classroom or in the classroom, but also on the streets. In my first year at Cornell, I had the opportunity to walk picket with the Union of Service and Maintenance Workers that had been organized with the help of the United Auto Workers. Became Local 2300 of the UAW. They had won their election in 1980, and they were fighting for their first contract, and they had to go out on strike. So I had the opportunity as a very junior member of this effort to organize student support for that strike and also to walk picket with the service and maintenance workers. At the same time, the campus cops were organizing a union, so I had the opportunity to lend some support to them. So I had a real labor education at Cornell in addition to the labor education I got at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, which is the premier institution in the world on that topic. And so labor activism at Cornell has a long-standing, venerable history. And there's a group of students on campus right now who are fighting an important fight. And the genesis of that fight is some union-busting activity by Starbucks. And let me just say, we've now gotten to the point where saying union-busting and Starbucks is a redundancy. It seems to be their go-to move. There were, maybe still are, but not for long, 3 Starbucks stores in Ithaca, New York. One of them was on College Avenue, right off the Cornell campus. And I had at one time or another been to all of them. And they all unionized with Workers United. They all organized and had an election, and they all won. And the way that Starbucks responded to that is it closed not 1, not 2, but all 3 of the locations in Ithaca, New York. Now, the idea that a college town would not need a place that serves people coffee is insane. It's not a business decision. It's a union-related decision. So there are some students on the Cornell campus who understandably were infuriated by this effort by Starbucks to deprive the workers in their stores in Ithaca of their legitimate right to be represented by a union. And those students protested the university's relationship with Starbucks. Now, apparently Cornell has a contract with Starbucks. Starbucks is the coffee provider for the university. There may be more than one, but Starbucks is certainly one of the coffee providers for the university. And my guess is it's a pretty lucrative contract because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of students, plus staff, plus faculty, plus visitors, plus conferences who are on the Cornell campus. And so it's a lot of coffee. My guess is lots and lots of coffee. And my guess is that Starbucks makes a lot of money off of that relationship with Cornell. And so the students want Cornell to end their relationship with Starbucks. And so they, in a long-standing tradition on Cornell campus, they occupied Day Hall, which is the main administration building at Cornell, and they insisted on meeting with the president of the university, Martha Pollack, and they laid out 3 demands, and they were successful in getting the university to agree to those 3 demands. Now, one of the demands was not immediately cessation of the contract. I don't think they can get that right away, but I've been in touch with 2 of the student leaders, Danielle and Nick, who are leading this effort on the Cornell campus. And Nick is a former barista. I don't know if Danielle is. She may be as well, but certainly a very strong supporter of the baristas who are organizing with Workers United, an SEIU affiliate, at Starbucks around the country. More than 300 Starbucks now have organized with Workers United. It's a very, very important story because it forces institutions around the country to articulate their values and live their values. And for an institution like Cornell University that is home to the premier industrial and labor relations school in the world and has unions among a number of its staff, they really have to make a choice about whether they are going to do business with union-busting employers like Starbucks. And obviously, for me, that's not a hard choice. As an alum, as somebody who loves the institution and believes that it was founded as a land-grant institution to serve the public, you can't serve the public and support union busting. You can't be on the right side of the issues and support union busting. And if you're giving a huge contract to a food provider that busts unions, you're doing the wrong thing. So I certainly enthusiastically join with those students in urging Cornell to immediately end their contract with Starbucks. If they can't immediately end it for legal reasons, they should not renew it whenever it comes due. I believe it comes due in 2025. My hope is that they could, because of Starbucks lawbreaking, would be able to end the contract sooner. I don't know if those contracts have morals clauses or law compliance clauses in them, but they should if they don't. The measure of success of the Cornell students' efforts, I think, need to go beyond whether or not they can change the behavior at Cornell University. It would be terrific if Cornell were to end its contract, and I really would like to see them do that. And I'm sure a lot of other alumni share that view. Whether or not you're somebody who's been active with labor issues for a long time like I have, or if you just think that Cornell should do the right thing and not be involved with an employer that exploits its workers and deprives them of democracy and voice in the workplace. But another measure of success is whether or not the effort at Cornell is taken up on other campuses around the country. Because my guess is that, in fact, it's not a guess, it's almost certain that Starbucks has similar relationships with other colleges and universities to provide gallons and gallons, tens of thousands of gallons of coffee to their students who are trying to study for exams, who are trying to get ready for a class, or whatever it is that they're doing, or just having a cookie. At Cornell, they have fantastic cookies, straight cookies, they're called. And there are lots and lots of colleges who have these relationships, and it's going to be up to the students on those campuses to bring this issue to the attention of their administrators and to put pressure on their college and university administrations to end their relationships with Starbucks. It's not just about Starbucks. It's about the integrity of the institution. It's about what your institution stands for. If you are an institution that believes in core democratic values, if you're an institution that believes that you have a responsibility to serve the public, that you are a progressive force, not in a political sense, but in the sense of spreading knowledge, advancing knowledge, creating new knowledge in our society, then you can't stand with a union buster. You just can't. Because they are fundamentally undemocratic. They're trying to deprive the people who work for them of the opportunity to have a say in their workplaces, to improve the quality of their lives, to share the knowledge that they have on the shop floor with management in a way that doesn't result in them getting fired or intimidated or disciplined. So it's going to be up to students on other campuses, not just the Cornell campus, but other campuses, to carry this fight to their administrations and to say to them, we don't want Union Buster coffee on our campus. We don't want to drink Union Buster coffee on our campus anymore. There are lots of other coffee companies out there, and I'm not going to vouch for them. I don't know what their practices are. But, you wouldn't, campuses wouldn't buy blood diamonds. They wouldn't be involved in supporting employers who are involved in other kinds of violations of basic rights. They shouldn't be involved in supporting employers, doing business with employers that violate labor rights. So one of the only unfortunate thing about the fact that this protest at Cornell happened in May is that Cornell's graduation is not until the end of May, and a lot of campuses have already had their graduations, and their campuses are largely empty, except for the students maybe who are studying for summer school. So it may be that we're not going to see this campus movement rise up over the course of the summer when students are back home or at jobs or at internships or whatever it is that they're doing, traveling, whatever it is that they do over the course of the summer. But when we get to Labor Day 2023, my hope is that we're seeing this kind of action by replicating what the students at Cornell did on dozens of campuses across the country. Because if you want to put fear in Howard Schultz's heart, the way to do it is to threaten his business, to cost him millions and millions and millions of dollars. That's the way you change the behavior of a big multinational company, by putting pressure on them where the pressure matters most, in their pocketbooks. Frighten their investors, the people who are counting on the dollars that students are spending on college campuses for coffee to make their profit off of their investments in Starbucks. So my hope is that we're going to see that kind of story show up in the stories that are being written by the 4 outstanding journalists you're about to hear me talk about. You're in for a great discussion with these labor reporters. It's really a pleasure. And I'll see you for a few minutes right after the Blogcast. Thanks.
So I think my role in this conversation is going to be to tell you all a bunch of stuff you already know and then sort of try to ask you a question about it in some kind of coherent way. So here's something you all know, and that is there's, I think, a really historically important and sizable amount of worker activism and labor activity in the political and policy realm that's going on right now. And you all know what it is. So right now, as we're recording this, there's a strike in Hollywood by the writers. There are negotiations with the Screen Actors Guild that are in the process of starting. There's organizing going on college campuses all around the country, including the one that I'm physically located on right now at Northeastern University. There's really striking levels of union busting by brand name companies, Starbucks, Amazon, Medieval Times, I could go on and on and on. We also have a labor-backed candidate for Secretary of Labor who may or may not get confirmed by the Senate. There's sort of an open question there, unfortunately. And we have massive transitions, huge transitions going on in the energy sector, in the automotive sector, in the entertainment sector, in your sector, which we're going to get to, manufacturing, infrastructure, all of which are going to weigh on worker power. So here's where I'd like to start. And Noam, let me start with you on this question. How do you decide what to cover? I mean, all four of you have very broad remits. None of you is like a beat reporter who shows up to the White House press room and waits for, to take dictation off of what the press secretary says. You all have very broad mandates. How do you decide from among this huge list of things that are going on in the world, what you're going to cover in any given day or week?
Sure. Yeah, good question. It's one that we think about internally a lot. I'm sure my colleagues here do the same. Over the years that I've been doing this, I think there are really two rules that I try to apply. I wouldn't say I do them categorically, but they're kind of two maybe principles that I try to apply when I think about how to prioritize stories. And the first I would say is that it's conceptually new. Often there are new iterations of familiar stories, and because of the sheer volume of stuff going on, that's usually a good way to sift out what probably is a lower priority. There are tons of nurses strikes or grad student strikes or contract negotiations that go on at any given moment. They're all extremely important to the people involved and can be important to the local economy or to the institution or even to the region that they're taking place in. But there's not often, not always, but often there's not a lot of conceptual ground being broken there. So those tend to be a lower priority. And then the second principle, I guess, is if it's just going to have a huge effect on the national economy. I mean, it can be conceptually not new at all, but if it's going to affect millions and millions of people and billions or tens of billions of dollars, then it's probably worth thinking about. And I would say we'll probably talk about this later, but the upcoming Teamsters EPS, the current Teamsters EPS negotiation, upcoming end of the contract that could lead to a strike, maybe in the category of one of these things that, even though it has some kind of conceptually interesting wrinkles, we've had these negotiations before. They've been going on for years. They've struck before, often not. But it's so important to the economy, logistics in this age of e-commerce. It just looms incredibly large. So obviously we're going to cover that and we're going to think about that a lot. So I think those are the two principles. Any given moment, there's something that I just find compelling. It may be sort of idiosyncratic. It may just have some unusual characters. It may be a way to, a story that's a useful vehicle for teaching readers about something in a way that you couldn't get to it, more directly. So there's always some kind of room to fudge, but those are the two big principles.
Yeah. So Alexandra, let me ask you the same question, but I want to preface it by saying you write beyond labor issues. Even you also write about gender issues and immigrant issues, and that's just some of what I've read that you've written. So how do you make how do you prioritize? And do you pick a story because it's a story that you think has legs, something that you're going to cover maybe in repeated articles, repeated commentaries? How do you make the choice?
Absolutely. There's definitely, I look into a story if it has legs, right? If I can have the foresight to think that there's room for follow-up potential, that's a story that I'm going to want to follow. Regardless, though, I like to think about the way these topics intersect. So you bring up, I do cover immigration, I do cover gender justice, abortion rights, et cetera, as well as labor. And these industries do intersect, these issues do intersect. So a story that I've written about in the past is, rights for undocumented workers, and that touches on immigration. A colleague of mine at Prism has written about workers' rights at the Guttmacher Institute, which has long been a hub for abortion policy and abortion information. And outside of that, talking more specifically about my labor reporting, I like to go into it thinking about who are the folks that we want to uplift, who are whose experiences do we want to highlight when we are doing this reporting. So speaking more specifically, we're talking about Black, brown, queer, trans folks who are they're on the ground doing the work. They're on the front lines of many labor movements across the country right now. And we want to make sure that they're the folks who are getting the attention, and they're the folks whose experiences are being highlighted, because many times they're the ones who are getting the low end of the ball with regards to how much they're getting paid, not as good benefits. And we want to make sure that they're being uplifted.
And they're the stories that are often not told, right? Because of
100%.
because of race, because of sex, because of sexual identity. They're just they're stories that are not treated as seriously as some others, and are not uplifted more broadly. So Tim, let me turn to you. I'm not going to call you a denizen of the Beltway, but you have covered sort of the intersection of labor politics and policy, and you've also, if it's fair to say this, and you'll tell me if it's not, you're as much a commentator now as you are a reporter.
Right.
So how are you making choices about what you're going to comment on? And do you feel like your realm is the policy and politics realm, including labor?
Yeah, I mean, I've always written about politics and policy in one format or another, mostly magazines, but also for Politico, which isn't quite a magazine and isn't quite a newspaper. It's more like a newspaper than a magazine. And I've worked in the sort of opinion realm, and I've also worked in the straight news realm. And my view is that the standards for the two are not that different. You know, I've always kind of put the explanatory function first and foremost, no matter, you know, whether it's a news story or an opinion piece. So in terms of, you know, what makes me choose something to write about, it's kind of an informal thing, but it's, I guess, you know, if I find something that interests me that looks like it isn't getting a lot of coverage elsewhere, I've almost sort of always, even when I was a newspaper reporter at the Wall Street Journal, I was always very conscious of being somebody who was writing for readers who would already know about a lot of the sort of bread and butter news that's out there. And of course, that's even more true today with the web. So I just try and think of something that feels like it's a little different. Either the information is a little different, or my interpretation of it is a little different. So that's been my modus operandi.
Yeah. So, and Matthew, you're as I've been reading some of your stuff, you seem to take more of an economics angle, sort of a left economics angle on a lot of these issues. Do I have that right? And are you looking for that in the stories, or is there just a lot to write about in that space right now? Because we're in a very odd economic moment, and as always, economic indicators are being used as weapons against workers, inflation being the principal among those. I've seen that you've written about that, as I have. So how are you making those judgments?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually a researcher for unions for 6 years. I kind of did the revolving door. And so, you know, I mean, what I found that workers were really interested in, you know, and this kind of guides my labor coverage. I do other coverage too, but in terms of my labor coverage is, you know, real kind of cold, hard facts about their employers' operating position, because I found that the regular media coverage of this tends to be pretty surface level, mainly just because there's just so few resources. So I've done kind of a working series on on kind of when strikes happen, most recently with the Rutgers strike, of just kind of digging into what the employer is choosing to prioritize as opposed to giving the workers what they want. So in the case of Rutgers, they have massively expanded their investments in hedge funds, for example, in the last, as most other investors have been getting out of it in the last 5 years. So that's kind of one example there. But you see that with hospitals, you see that in a different way with the railroads, and so that's kind of how I try to attack kind of labor coverage.
Sort of corporate, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but corporate power angle.
Yeah.
Some of
Yeah.
this
I
stuff.
mean, yeah. So I was like a corporate campaigner for unions for 6 years. So this is kind of what I did. And I found that workers were very interested in it. And so, yeah.
Good, helpful. So given all of that, all of your assessments of what stories you're going to write about and how you make your choices, Alexandra, let me start with you on this one. What is the biggest and most important labor story around right now, about labor, about workers, about worker power, regardless of whether you're personally covering it? What would you say is the biggest and most important story out there?
Well, I guess it's pretty expected, but I think the ongoing coverage of unionizing in these the biggest corporations, Amazon, Starbucks, that's huge. It's huge to see worker power amass in that way, and to see it trickle down into hopefully the quality of the work, the quality of the conditions in which they're working. Outside of that, I think a story that, and this is jumping to your next question, but I think the story that I think should be top of mind is looking into nonprofits and how nonprofits need to be unionizing. Because if nonprofits are the ones doing the work to protect workers and to ensure that folks are taken care of and provided for, they need to be held accountable for their own indiscretions and their own abuse of power.
Yeah, you did jump ahead, but I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to expand on that a little bit, because I think the question of what's the biggest story we're not talking about right now is a very important one. I promise that we're going to get to that, but I want to, Tim, let me stick with this question. That's, what's the biggest and most important story that's out there right now that's sort of, there are emblematic stories or sort of epical stories. And Alexandra's point that the organizing at Amazon, Starbucks, some of the other brand name companies is in that league. Would you agree with that, one? And second, are there others that you would throw into that mix for biggest and most important?
Sorry, who's the question for?
That was a question for Tim.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought
Tim,
that was,
you were,
yes.
no, I was worried you were frozen. Oh no, God, my goodness.
I did homework for this assignment.
Oh, how about
I
that?
had a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 topics, any one of which could be a plausible, most important topic.
All right, so give us pick the top one that's not the one Alexandra just gave us.
Yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about the nonprofit stuff, because that's one of mine. The unionization of the bourgeoisie, where which I think Noam is writing a book about, if I'm not mistaken, which is the interesting phenomenon of highly educated, poorly paid workers, graduate students, adjunct professors, journalists, people who work for nonprofits. It's an especially promising area for union organizers, because they're highly educated, they are likelier to be well-versed in the reasons for why people create unions. And they're also probably a little more left than sort of the usual group of people. So I think that is very interesting. My own well, if we're just talking about this precise moment, I guess the most unusual, I'll give you my most unusual entry, which is the debt ceiling, which I wrote about yesterday. We don't think of that as a labor issue, but the National Association of Government Employees is suing Joe Biden, who they endorsed 10 days ago. And it's a funny way to show how much they love him, but they are suing him. And they're suing him. It's a very interesting lawsuit brought by, among others, Thomas Gagan, who I think probably everybody on this in this meeting is familiar with. And Tom has a very, kind of lively and original mind. And I don't know if this lawsuit was his idea or not, but it's an interesting one, and he's usually associated with interesting ideas. The idea of this lawsuit is that Biden cannot do anything to plan for for default. He cannot prioritize in ways that we know that Obama did back in 2011 when we had the last serious confrontation over this. And the reason he can is because the debt ceiling law, which goes back to 82 and then originally to 1917, does not specify what the executive branch should do in the event of non-agreement. It's different in that respect from the Anti-Deficiency Act, which covers government shutdowns, which the Anti-Deficiency Act actually says, if this doesn't get worked out, if the executive and Congress can't agree on a budget, the executive will acquire certain emergency powers, and it will be able to keep essential functions going. There's no language like that in the debt limit lawsuit, and therefore, Nage is arguing, Biden is obliged to ignore the debt ceiling law because it's unconstitutional, and if he were to do anything to prioritize spending or even prepare for prioritizing spending, he would be in the same position Richard Nixon was in the 1970s when he had his big fight over impoundment with Congress.
Right.
In the same position Donald Trump was in 2019 when he held up military funding for Ukraine. The president doesn't have power of the purse. Nage's interest in this is that they represent government workers who
and they don't want those folks. They don't want those folks to lose their jobs, right? I mean, that's the
and already one of the extraordinary measures that's being carried out right now is that they've stopped funding Nage's pension.
Right.
So,
Interesting. So let me bring Matthew in. Matthew, what is? You don't have to hold up a sheet showing that you did your homework. I'm going to trust that you did your homework here. I don't ask my students to do that either. So Matthew, what's the biggest, most important labor story that's going on right now?
Yeah, I mean, Noam touched on this earlier, but yeah, I mean, I think the UPS contract negotiations, and then sorry, I was away from my mic. I think the UPS contract negotiations and the big three auto negotiations are probably the two most consequential kind of things in terms of unions. In terms of labor more broadly, I think this whole recent exposure of a Blackstone portfolio company employing child labor, I think both the rise of child labor again, and then also private equity owned workplaces having really atrocious working conditions. Those are kind of the two things. Those dovetail with unions as well, but in terms of kind of the broader space of kind of working conditions and workers' rights, those are two really, really important stories that I plan on covering more, and that I think every labor journalist in the country has an eye towards as well.
But I agree with you, and Noam's colleague Hannah Dreyer wrote a fantastic news-making, impactful story about the migrant child labor story. There's a broader child labor story that's not just about migrant children, but her story I think really helped to focus attention. And I know it changed behavior in the government, no question about it. Noam, what's the biggest story? Since Tim stole your book idea for his answer, if not for his, he may have a parallel book coming out. I don't even know, but what's the biggest story going on, biggest labor story going on right now?
Yeah, thanks for the plug, Tim. Yeah, look, I think a lot of what my colleagues here said, Amazon to me is still the kind of, the highest stakes story. Probably Amazon is it's so big, it touches so many industries and employs so many workers. It really is a kind of existential issue, question for labor, whether labor will be able to break through at Amazon. Obviously, the ALU won at Staten Island last year, but there's no bargaining there yet. And so, yeah, I think the Amazon story is probably, as a practical matter, the biggest story. I think, I think the WGA strike, the writer's strike in Hollywood, is a big story, not because economically it's so important, though it's a big industry, a big, wealthy, powerful industry, but I think it's it's just kind of an gives you entree into all these issues that are affecting white collar workers, whether it's artificial intelligence or the kind of gigification or outsourcing of work, all these things we see in other professions, certainly in journalism and in law, architecture, a lot of professions, a lot of white collar workers are dealing with issues that are very much at stake in that labor stoppage. So I think that's a big deal. On the question of the the sort of class of college educated workers who are organizing, to me, there's no question that we're seeing those workers organize at nonprofits and bookstores and museums. But to me, the biggest, probably most impactful subplot in that story is that these big companies, where you've had just a pretty crappy job market for college educated workers. It really starts in kind of 2004-05, though it gets much worse after the Great Recession. And it didn't really get better, meaningfully better, until 2019. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So it's been a 15-year run, even longer, of not great job market for college educated people. And as a result, a lot of those folks have gone to work at, big companies. Starbucks, I think, has a ton of college educated people. Trader Joe's, REI, even Amazon, you see college educated people. And so to me, it's, when this thing was happening at, Washington think tanks, and it was happening at, environmental nonprofits and independent bookstores, Politics and Prose in DC, it was an important phenomenon, but it hadn't achieved critical mass. But when it sort of jumped the rails to the Starbucks and Trader Joe's of the world, suddenly I think it becomes a phenomenon that has real kind of importance to the, to the national economy, to the labor market broadly. And I think that's, clearly something to watch.
Yeah. Boy, a lot of really terrific answers in there. I want to pick up on one stream that several of you mentioned, and that is bargaining. I wrote a piece on the blog about how 2023, to the extent that 2022 was the year of organizing, 2023 is really, I think, the biggest story, or the biggest theme, is going to be collective bargaining, for the reasons that you mentioned. 365,000 workers at UPS, the still ongoing West Coast ports negotiations involving 22,000 workers, and one of the most impactful industries for the economy as a whole. That's one of the reasons President Biden got involved there. The bargaining between that Matthew mentioned, involving the big three and the UAW. And I would also say the UAW trying to get contracts in the electric vehicle and battery realm, but also the negotiations that are going on at Amazon and also at Starbucks, because one of the consequences of the fact that those companies are the highest profile organizing successes of 2022 is that now folks are watching to see if the workers can reap the benefits of their organizing in the form of a collective bargaining agreement and improved wages, improved benefits, better worker safety, all of the things that those unions have said that they want. You also have two brand new union presidents actually running as reform candidates, Sean Fain and Sean O'Brien. Thank goodness none of you have started calling them the two Seans. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. But they have both said that they're going to bring a new level of militancy to the organizing. So they're setting the bar for their own negotiations very, very high. So am I, and I'm going to invite you to criticize me, Tim. I'm going to start with you because you're the most likely to criticize me in this group. Do I have it right? Is 2023 the year of collective bargaining in the way that 2022 is the year of worker organizing?
I think if only if it were only the West Coast ports, it would be a year of collective bargaining, because the West Coast ports, dock workers are the only blue collar workers who benefit from the decline of U.S. manufacturing, and they make a remarkable amount of money. And that's because they have remarkable leverage, which is something unions used to have across the board in industrial America. And now they only have influence. I'm hard pressed to think of any union that has the leverage that the dock workers have on the West Coast. So it's kind of interesting.
The unions that had that kind of leverage were the freight rail unions, but because of the law that they were operating under, they didn't get to use that leverage, right? The Railway Labor Act kept them from using it. ILWU is operating under the National Labor Relations Act, so it's a lot harder to stop them. Sorry, go ahead.
It's fascinating to someone like me who, I've only been covering labor. I cover a lot of things. I don't just cover labor, but I've only really been, edited a labor publication at Politico, and I have been really interested in labor for about 10 years. And, so I don't, and although I am old, I really don't know a lot about the old days when, the 60s and I guess into the 70s, when industrial unions had a lot of clout. So the West Coast negotiations are this really interesting look into the past for me. It used to be presidents paid a lot of attention when all sorts of unions were working out their contracts. Now, there's only really 2 or 3 industries where that's true. I also want to go back to what Matthew was talking about, is child labor, because this, it took me by surprise that this became a big issue in 2023. It seemed to come out of nowhere. And partly that's because that New York Times piece did such a great job of documenting really, unprecedented levels of child labor among migrant children, but also the statistic. I hadn't looked lately at the statistics, and the statistic for coming out of DOL was that since 2018, there's been a 69% in child labor violations, which is just off the charts. And on top of that, you have this wild partisan divide where the Republican Party has actually positioned itself as the party that's in favor of child labor, which sounds like a bad joke. But at the state level, Republicans are pushing very hard to ease child labor laws. We've had, what are the states? New Hampshire, Arkansas, Iowa, and New Jersey. I'd put an asterisk by New Jersey because I actually don't think the New Jersey law is a matter of great concern. But the other 3 are matters of enormous concern.
Yeah.
And you would think, I've been writing, hey, Democrats, why aren't you making hay here? This is appalling. It's also inhibited, interestingly, the Republican response to the Times story about child migrants working, because the Republicans don't know exactly how much they want to complain about the Biden administration's failures at HHS and DOL in enforcing labor laws that they don't especially like to begin with.
Yeah, they don't want immigrants coming into the country unless they can put their children to work. I mean, that's essentially seems to be their position. Matthew, let me turn to you. Collective bargaining in 2023, is that really where we need to be focusing our attention? And it certainly fits into your corporate power analysis. In fact, it is maybe the rawest demonstration of corporate power. What we're seeing with Starbucks, what we're seeing with Amazon, it's also a raw demonstration of the failure of American labor law. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be some great and very important stories there. I mean, I would just say, right now, Amazon and Starbucks have a really uphill battle to get their employers to the table. I think there's components of that are attributable to labor law. I think there's other components that are attributable to um, internal problems within those own unions, in terms of kind of not understanding the gravity of the situation that they're facing, in terms of how intransigent these employers will be. I mean, Mary Kay Henry sits on the board of an AI advisory council with Melody Hobson, the Starbucks chair, which to me is just bizarre, for example. And and so
Do you think they go out for coffee together? I've wondered about that.
I have no idea, but yeah, I mean, I think Workers United is taking this fight seriously, but Workers United is part of a much larger union. And it's by far SEIU's largest NLRB victories since forever, and I'm frankly astounded at kind of the lack of seriousness that I see evincing from SEIU's leadership in terms of acknowledging that these workers have voluntarily chosen to join their union, and that's going to require, frankly, tens of millions of dollars and an all-out kind of strategy, to even get Starbucks to the table, much less kind of winning a contract, And then on Amazon's side, yeah, I mean, they, it's great to have an independent rank and file led union, unfortunately, when they stopped winning more NLRB elections, it's a very open question as to kind of what the real strategy is for bringing Amazon to the table.
Yeah.
One thing I just did want to end on, though, I do disagree, though, Tim, in terms of that the ILWU benefited from the decline of manufacturing unions. I mean, any successful strike, really goes through, local labor councils, however moribund they may be, and the fact that those labor councils are now, are just complete and utter shells of their former selves because of the decline of manufacturing unions, means that any battle that the West Coast dock workers have against the ports, is just going to be far more difficult than there were in the heyday of the steel workers and the IUE and the other major manufacturing unions.
Yeah. So Noam, there are so many examples of successful collective bargaining agreements in just recently. So my favorite sport, the NBA, I think has a brand new six-year contract with its players. Major League Baseball, the UAW settled its contract with Caterpillar without a strike. You also had successful strikes fairly recently in the last year or two at Deere and at Kaiser Permanente and other employers where the unions got much, much better contracts, very, very strong contracts. So lots of success in the collective bargaining space, but we're all talking about the really, really risky ones, the big ones. What's the larger story about collective bargaining? Is there a larger story about collective bargaining? Because the whole institution is under attack. Essentially, what Starbucks and Amazon are doing is attacking collective bargaining itself. Is there a larger story to be told about collective bargaining, or is that, as you were saying, it's sort of not very novel? It's been around for such a long time. There's not really much more to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, my take on Starbucks and Amazon and Apple, these companies where there are these active campaigns that have won some victories and are struggling to either get the employer to the table or make progress at the table, is I don't know that these corporations are especially evil. I think they're pretty immoral, as a lot of corporations are. But as you say, labor law is pretty weak and pretty porous, so there's not really a forcing mechanism. I mean, you can run up the unfair labor practice charges and the complaints and go through the ALJ process and appeal to the board and then go to federal court. And if you're lucky, at the end of 10 years, maybe there'll be some consequence. So if you're running one of these corporations, why would you be deterred in any way by that process? And then two, I mean, just the way that capitalism, the way that financial markets work, with the rise of hedge funds and activist investors, I think you will often find, and if you can get such an investor to be candid with you, they will probably concede that oftentimes they look at labor costs as like a leading indicator of profits. So you have situations where a company can report, higher earnings, but higher labor costs, and the share price will go down. People will sell that stock because they get spooked by higher labor costs, even at a time of rising profits. And so I think the intersection of those two things, where investors are really aggressively, after companies to minimize labor costs, and labor law that really puts no pressure on companies to bargain a contract, you get kind of what we're seeing. And why would you expect anything different on some level? To me, the big stories in bargaining this year, beyond those, obviously we're going to watch Amazon and Apple and Starbucks, Trader Joe's. I think two stories that I would watch really carefully are, one, whether the UAW can use some of its leverage in the usual pattern bargaining with the big three to try to nudge things forward a little on the EV side. I think Sean Fain has talked about this as the new president.
Sean Fain, the new president, right, of the UAW. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, he's been critical of the previous UAW regime for really not using the leverage they have to try to get some better deals in the EV space. A lot of what we see, we see this, with GM and Ford. Well, they'll do these joint ventures with, a Korean battery manufacturer, and because it's a joint venture and it's not GM or Ford, the bargaining agreement doesn't apply. If GM or Ford opens a new assembly plant, in the UAW contract, under the UAW contract, they're neutral, and I think there may even be a carjack provision. But basically, it's pretty easy to unionize a new GM plant, a new Ford plant, a new Stellantis plant. But under the joint ventures, we start from scratch. There's no neutrality agreement, and the companies do not need to stand down. And so you get these joint ventures in Georgia and in Tennessee, and places that are not very hospitable to organizing. It seems pretty unlikely that the UAW is going to have a lot of success there. And I think Fain's vision, and we'll see how well he executes on it, is to try to pressure them to be neutral in elections in a place like Tennessee or Georgia, even with these joint ventures. So I think that's something to watch. The other thing that I would watch is, which of these companies where we saw some organizing have success last year are the conditions maybe most favorable for getting on contract, and could that then create some momentum in other places? And if I were betting, I would say REI is the one place where I think, we might see a contract the soonest. They've been resistant to the organizing, like Starbucks and Apple, but you've got a union there that kind of knows what it's doing, RWDSU. They're a pretty activist union. They take the stuff very seriously. They've had success negotiating contracts in other non-union industries. And my sense is that they're getting down to real bargaining at, one or two of the stores that they've already unionized. If I had to put money on it, I would guess that REI may be the first of last year's wave to actually get a contract. And if they do, that could reverberate to other places. Is Trader Joe's going to be able to resist bargaining, meaningful bargaining if there's a contract with REI? Is Starbucks going to be able to, this stuff tends to develop a momentum on its own. So I think the REI story could be interesting and important, both on its own terms and kind of, unjamming a kind of clogging that's happening because labor law is so weak.
Interesting. That's the most optimistic take I've heard, that REI could be the first of several dominoes to fall. I'm gonna maintain a healthy skepticism about that until we see how it plays out. Alexandra, I want to start with the same question, but I want to take you in a slightly different angle on this question, if you don't mind. So we're able to talk about all those other stories because those workers have collective bargaining rights, but there are lots and lots of workers, many of them workers of color, many of them women, who have no collective bargaining rights at all, not merely because they don't have unions, but because they can't even have unions. Right? So you have farm workers. The overwhelming majority of farm workers have no collective bargaining rights. You have domestic workers who don't have collective bargaining rights. Undocumented workers, while they're technically within the law, are or technically protected by the National Labor Relations Act really have no functional ability to organize a union because of the risk of government intervention by expelling them from the country. A lot of home health workers because don't have an employment relationship can't really organize. Do we miss out on those stories? If I'm right that 2023 is the year of collective bargaining, I'm setting up a criticism of myself. By the way, I'm setting you up to criticize me, and I don't mean to do it that way. I'm sorry if it sounds that way, but this is a hole in my argument that 2023 is the year of collective bargaining. Does that leave out a whole bunch of workers that we really should be talking about?
I think there's space for both of those things to be true. I'm going to play devil's advocate.
You're going to keep me from arguing with myself. I appreciate that. I can't even criticize myself in this. You all are so nice. Go ahead.
I definitely think we do need to be focusing on the workers who are not traditionally able to unionize. In that sense, I think we need to be looking locally. There are local organizations who are pushing for unionization of domestic workers, for undocumented workers. I'm based here in Miami, and we have an abundance of organizations that are fighting for local legislation to pass heat standards so that farm workers are not passing out in the 99 degree heat in South Florida, so that domestic workers have the right to take a break or to get benefits. All of these things are happening at a local level. And I think in that sense, maybe the story needs to be more focused on the local communities that are doing this work. Outside of that, I do think collective bargaining is an important story for this year because it's about carrying that momentum and continuing to hold the organizations accountable to make sure that they come to the table and meet the needs of the workers.
Well, terrific. Let me get to my last question. I'm going to ask you each to keep it to about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes in your responses. Alexandra previewed this question before. What's the story we're not talking about that we should be talking about? What's the really big story or the quiet story or the very impactful story that we didn't mention yet that we should be talking about? And I'm open to your saying it's journalism. We need to be talking about labor in journalism because there's a lot going on. Strike at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, walkout by the reporters and others at the New York Times. Huge lots of organizing, huge amounts of organizing going on in your industry. So what's the and Matthew, I'll start with you on this. What's the big story or or important story or impactful story or the story that's going to grow that maybe is a little seed right now that we all need to be talking about?
I'm not sure if I have a crystal ball, here, I mean, I think that, one thing that is just interesting to me as somebody who still consults with a healthcare union is just watching kind of our healthcare system just completely falling apart, kind of relative to kind of when I started in the healthcare space 5 years ago. And everybody seems at their wit's end. And patients are being failed in far more catastrophic ways than they were very recently. And that's one thing that it's from the stories that I hear from nurses that I know, it seems like the other shoe is about to drop and we're about to see something very significant, whether it's organizing or whether it's, us coming to some very hard truths about what our healthcare system actually looks like and how much COVID has frankly destroyed it. That I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great call out. And let me just say it's highly likely that nurses will be the leading edge of that story because there are multiple crises going on in the nursing corps in our country. Noam, what's the story that we didn't talk about that we need to be talking about?
I'm going to go in a slightly different direction
Sure.
with the framing of the question, or with my way of thinking about the question. I would combine two stories that we've talked about. One is the Teamsters UPS contract negotiations and potential strike, and the other is Amazon organizing. I hear a lot from Amazon workers who are very interested in that strike and kind of following it closely and thinking through what implications it might have for them. And, I think it's not crazy to imagine seeing an uptick in not necessarily sort of union organizing, but some other forms of organizing, workplace organizing that come on the heels of a possible Teamsters UPS strike. So, for example, you have UPS delivery stations around the country that are kind of, or sorting hubs or whatever, that are going idle, and then Amazon workers at Amazon delivery stations in those same cities saying, well, this could be a good time for us to strike too, because Amazon may be thinking that we're going to benefit from this UPS strike. It will just swing our own delivery network into action, but actually this is a real fat target of opportunity for us at the same moment. So the way that those two labor stories interact and possibly intersect, I think could be something to watch. Now, obviously, if the strike doesn't happen or gets resolved in a few days, then it's moot. But if it's something that goes on for a longer period of time, I can imagine workers who are already doing some organizing in Amazon thinking strategically about the opportunities that the Teamsters UPS strike presents.
But even if there's not a strike, if Sean O'Brien cuts a deal with UPS that significantly improves the lives of the drivers there,
Yep.
That's going to be a very important organizing tool with respect to Amazon. And although I haven't had an opportunity to talk to him about it yet, I'm quite confident that while Sean is very focused, I'm sure, on UPS, he's looking over their shoulders at Amazon and hoping that they are the next target if he's successful with UPS. Alexandra, you started us out on this topic by talking about unions at not-for-profits. Do you want to expand on that, or do you want to add another topic in that we're not talking about that we should be talking about in the labor space?
Well, I have two answers to that. One, yes, definitely the nonprofit industrial complex, I think, needs to be the big story this year because so many people are impacted by that. And I think folks rely on nonprofits to advocate for them. And we look to them as we idolize them and we idealize them and we think that they're these ethical organizations when in reality, many of them are enshrouded with hypocrisy and don't treat their workers with the same rights that they advocate for, or the ethics that they advocate for. So I think that is a story that needs to be touched on. Many of them end up being these environmental organizations, which are historically white-led, white male-led, and they're enshrouded with white supremacy, and that trickles into the advocacy. So it's the work that they're putting out effective or impactful if they're not practicing what they preach. The other story that I think is important that it is happening now is here in Florida, the immigration law that passed, which essentially says that you can't be an undocumented worker anymore. So I'm curious to see how is that going to impact Florida's economy and the economy across the country, because our farm workers supply tomatoes for a majority of this country. So I think that's an important one to look at. And of course, Florida is essentially a breeding ground for conservative policy in other states and other conservative states. They love to copy Ron DeSantis. So I'm curious to see if Governor Abbott follows suit and does something similar. And then how is that going to impact farm workers, undocumented workers, and local economies?
I very much like the use of the phrase breeding ground, which is usually associated with disease. I think that was an apt way of using that phrase. Good for you. Tim, you're going to get the last word on this. What is and feel free to refer to your copious notes on this question. What is the story we haven't been talking about that we should be talking about?
Well, there's one item on my list that we never got to, so I'm going to mention that, which is not specifically a union issue, although unions get involved in it, but this huge social change. I'm speaking to you from the offices of the New Republic, and I am the only person here. And that's, I think the rest of you are all working from home. Is that right?
Not me.
Oh, you're in an office.
I am.
This is a huge social change, and it's fascinating in lots of different ways. For starters, I never would have guessed that white collar workers would have the clout, many of them non-union, probably most of them non-union, would have the clout to force the change that we have seen in office work. Employers are having a very, very hard time, much harder than I would have thought, getting workers to return to the office. So it's a weird context in which workers, at least white collar workers, turn out to have much more clout than I ever would have guessed. What is it? Gallup said sort of 60% of office workers went to the office every day before the pandemic. Then it, dropped to 12% at the height of the pandemic. Now it's about 21%. And it might be a case of, workers, be careful what you wish for, because the dynamic favors employers in lots of unexamined ways that I think people are only starting to look at. There was a wild story about McDonald's actually sending all its employees home so that it could do layoffs without having to, I guess, maintain a budget for Kleenex when they told people they were fired. I think it's easier to fire people when you have remote work. The Journal had a fantastic story about a worker at the Society for Human Resource Management in Northern Virginia who went up to her boss and she said, "I'd like to work out of North Carolina." And the boss, who actually went on the record using his own name, Johnny Taylor, said that gave him the brilliant idea that he should fire her and replace her with a worker in India. So case of Asheville good, Bangalore better. And he was unembarrassed talking about this on the record using his own name. He said he saved 40% in labor costs. Isn't that fabulous? I also think workers get along less well when they don't see each other every day. I think, and I think it's catastrophic for interns especially, who don't get a chance to make the relationships that, these intangible aspects to work are real, and I think that, so I wrote a piece for the New Republic a few weeks ago about how I really think this is going to hurt workers.
Interesting. That's interesting. All of what you all said was interesting, and I'm going to stop us there, only because, not because we don't have a lot more. I have more questions, but we don't have any more time, and we've already lost Matthew. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to have this conversation with us. So you can find Matthew Cunningham-Cook in The Lever. You can find Alexandra Martinez writing in Prism. You can find Noam Scheiber in the New York Times. You can find Timothy Noah in the New Republic. You can find me and this video and other blogcasts on the Power at Work blog. Thank you all. Really a terrific conversation. Great to see all of you all. The only criticism I have is that you're not quoting me enough in your work. That's my only comment, and I'd like you to take that under advisement going forward. Yeah. Thanks you all. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.
All right, there's our Labor Reporters Roundtable discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. If you want to stay up to date on new content that we post on the Power at Work blog, I want to very strongly encourage you to subscribe. Just stay here on the Power at Work blog, click on the subscribe button and give us your email address, and we'll send you a weekly update on what's new on the blog. We'll also, at the end of every week, send you the weekly download, which is a collection of a couple of dozen labor, worker power stories and other things from around the internet, studies, academic research, think tank reports that we collect every week. It's a good way to stay in touch with us. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Both places you can follow us at Power at Work blog. That's at Power at Work blog. It'll allow us to keep you updated on what we're doing. We've got some great content. I did an interview with Tony Clark, who's the executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association, about their great success organizing minor leaguers. I've interviewed Andy Levin, former congressman and former vice chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, about some current labor issues and what's going on in his home state of Michigan. Every first Friday of the month, we do a blogcast about the latest jobs, wages, and unemployment report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So subscribe, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, come back here to the Power at Work blog often. We'll see you again here soon. Thanks.